Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, as we close off season 10 shortly, we have a very special guest, Lisa Miller. She is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Eckerd College, where her research and teaching center on gender, sexuality, intimacy, health, and aging across the life. With a distinctive blend of qualitative insight and quantitative rigor, she challenges conventional narratives about aging and sexuality, bringing much needed attention to the ways people, especially women and LGBTQ plus individuals, experience agency, pleasure, and transformation over time. Her work dismantles harmful stereotypes about older adult sexuality and offers a vision of later life as a site of growth, renewal, and deep relational meaning. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Thanks for asking. I'm doing really good. I was telling you earlier, I got to Indianapolis. I was actually just at Niagara Falls, and I was taken aback by just how insane those waterfalls are. Have you been before?
I have not. It's on my bucket list.
Yeah. I mean, I went there when I was like 8, I think, and I came back 20 years later, and it was kind of like a cool full circle moment. But this whole season's been about pleasure, but it's the first time we're going to actually connect it with the intersection of age. And I think that's such a unique dimension. But before we begin that, I just want to know a little bit more about you. I'm curious, how did you find your interest researching and working with pleasure?
Sure, that's a great question. Uh, I I began interest in this topic truthfully because I study the intersections of gender and sexuality. And so I have been interested in things like the orgasm gap, for example. So we know on average that women report lower rates of orgasm. And so that is where I got my start, scholarly speaking, as a gender scholar. But I would say that what I what really struck me is that older adult women are often absent from conversations about women's experiences with sexual pleasure in particular. And so I found myself asking questions such as what happens after women leave college environments, for example, where it's well known that young adult women, for example, don't experience sexual pleasure at the same rates as young men. What happens in midlife, for example? Could aging, for example, be a catalyst for women experiencing greater sexual pleasure? And so I began with really broadly thinking about the orgasm gap and then asking myself questions such as would that gap maybe change as women age? Are there key and vital parts of the aging process, socially speaking, for example, but also from a psychological lens as well, that might lead women to experiencing greater pleasure? More recently, though, I would say that I have been struck by the lack of conversation about pleasure more broadly, including like in the field of sexuality studies, for example. We tend to study issues such as like decline and dysfunction is like very common, especially among biomedical kinds of researchers. And so I have been struck by how little sexuality scholars actually talk about pleasure and things like joy. Instead, we tend to approach our research often from what's called a deficit perspective, where we focus on negative dimensions of social and sexual life. And so, more recently, I've really taken interest in doing more and more work on really both, I'd say, sexual pleasure and joy, more broadly speaking.
And so when you differentiate between these two, can you maybe expand a little bit more on what pleasure even looks like then?
Sure. So, in terms of women's sexuality or just sexuality more broadly, to some degree, pleasure has been narrowly sort of measured as the absence or presence of an orgasm. However, I would argue that that's not necessarily the only measure that we should use for sexual pleasure. For example, I would say, just broadly speaking, if someone has a positive sexual experience that they would classify as satisfying, that's a way that we should talk about pleasure. If joy is cultivated in the bedroom in an intimate life, for example, that's a way that we should characterize pleasure, that we should really avoid limited kinds of measures about pleasure and really open it up to thinking about how women might experience pleasure a little differently beyond just a narrow view of like the orgasm gap, for example.
Mm. Have you happened to look across different cultures to see what causes this gap?
So I mainly focus on the United States in my research, to be honest with you, and so that gap is largely driven by different gender expectations, particularly when we look at heterosexual couples in the U.S., but I would say in much of the Western world more generally. That, for example, we tend to have very discrepant kinds of social expectations for women versus men, particularly heterosexual women and men, when it comes to sexuality. I think we're all sort of intimately aware of the fact that women, for example, tend to be shamed for casual sex practices outside of monogamous relationships, whereas men, for example, tend to be rewarded, right, for sexual conquest, securing more partners, casual sex kinds of interactions. Essentially, men's manhood is affirmed by virtue of the fact that they're having casual sex. Whereas I like to say that women's femininity is under attack, for example, if they don't adhere to expectations that they be sexually pure. And so I often say that gender is at the heart of the sexual double standard, or discrepant views of how women and men should behave in intimate life is so often driving the orgasm gap, for example. And I definitely write about that in much of my work, that if we had different gender expectations, it is likely that the orgasm gap would probably be reduced, particularly because women are internalizing these expectations, and maybe they have a lot of stigma around sex, which, for better or for worse, leaves its imprint on the body in terms of how pleasure is physiologically experienced or not experienced.
Hmm. I mean, I think the feeling of shame is something that's so powerful and can be internalized often. And it seems to be a central piece in a lot of this, especially just the feelings of pleasure in general, no matter where it is, especially if you develop a relationship with it where you're like, am I supposed to be feeling this? Am I allowed to feel this? I'm curious from your research, shame primarily, I'm assuming, comes from a few sources. It can come from your society, it can come from family, it can come from the literature that you read. Out of the kind of different sources that it can arise, what do you feel like leads shame, particularly around these topics?
Yeah, I would say that sexual shame stems from a few key social institutions and structures. A lot of people will probably remember their earliest sexual shame from their family, however, that, for example, sometimes there are very concrete messages received from parents, particularly for girls, that they should remain abstinent, for example, and that really a lot of conversations about sex are tied to risk in the family, for example. And so, of course, parents are going to tell their teenagers not to be sexually active, especially young girls, for fear that they will experience a teenage pregnancy. But that same kind of risk narrative, to be honest with you, Gautam, is present in the school system as well. And it's been widely written about, that abstinence only education tends to prevail. And so if you're told from as early as your sex education classes, for example, that you should choose abstinence, sexual shame is going to be a natural consequence, along with risk kinds of discourses where we're told that sex is inherently risky from a young age, that you should avoid engaging in sexual practices because you'll either come down with an STI that is deadly, for example, is the message. Or my students sometimes tell me that they, in their sex ed classes, that they receive photos, or they're made to view photos that are very grotesque, for example, of essentially genitalia that have decayed, so to speak, would be maybe a good way to put it.
Yeah, I feel like we've seen those. I've seen those too. In
Yes.
yeah,
And so they get these kinds of extreme images that tell them that essentially the body will be under decay if you contract a sexually transmitted illness. And so consequently, of course, they're going to start associating sex with notions of risk, which will inevitably lead to some sexual shame, suffice it to say. So those are just two key places. But of course, we could talk all day long, for example, about the institution of religion and the ways in which, especially evangelical Christianity, often pushes narratives topics about sexual purity on both young boys and girls, for example, but especially young women. And so there are all kinds of key places where I would say that young people are being socialized to try to avoid sexual practices. Although I will say that there is a notable gender difference that young boys from a young age are given more latitude when it comes to casual sex than young women are.
Hmm. I mean, I think this is just such a profound, it's just so interesting to me because I think the ways in which we internalize some of these topics can like it's so subtle. It's not something you actually really actively think about. And it's really funny because I've been road tripping with my dad and he actually just stepped out the room. And so if you noticed and I noticed, I was like, oh, I'm saying like these topics. I didn't even want to say the word sex out loud. I was like, oh no, because we had just had a conversation a couple days ago where for the first time I was just telling him about my sexual history. And, immediately the response was shame, right? Like, how could you? I can't believe you did all this. Like, this is terrible. This is not what we do in our culture. And I was having a conversation a couple days ago, actually, with another family friend. And his kind of take, and I'm really curious to hear what you think about this. His take was just that if his kids who are in the third grade and fourth grade are exposed to certain topics, they're more likely to engage in it rather than had they not heard about it at all. I'm curious if you feel, I mean, there's just so much complexity in this. For example, even like some cultures view sex very differently than other Western cultures, for example, where sex represents an act towards spiritual enlightenment, whatever it is, where it's like having that specific bond with one individual seems to be something that's like highly prioritized for like for whatever reason. But it's not just like a way of like control necessarily. It could be, but it's not only as a means of control. I'm curious, how do you navigate then that belief that, okay, if my kids even hear about it, then they're going to be interested in then doing it?
Yeah, I would really say, Gotham, that the onus is for us to take the science very seriously here. And so I consider myself a social and behavioral scientist. Some people might feel consider themselves sexologists as well. And so the data is actually very, very clear. It's been replicated time and time again that abstinence only education, where essentially when we tell youth to abstain from sex, in countries where that actually exists, we tend to see higher rates of teenage pregnancy and higher rates of STIs, which might seem counterintuitive to the average person. But if you're not teaching people, for example, how to have safe sex, not introducing them to contraceptives, for example, inevitably we're going to see higher rates of STIs and unplanned kinds of pregnancies. And so I actually am a parent and I'm sympathetic to that view that you want to protect your children, of course, and your teenagers in particular from STIs and unplanned pregnancy. But in full disclosure, that kind of approach of abstinence from a data perspective doesn't necessarily really yield the results that you might think it would. We'd be better off
Mm,
from a public health standpoint to make sure that young adults and young people in general, especially adolescents who are sexually active, to make sure they have access to condoms and measures that ensure that they're having safe sex, for example, and even birth control for teenagers. We know from a public health standpoint that we have to focus on prevention, for example, of unplanned
mm,
pregnancy and of STIs. And so abstinence is not the way. The data shows over and over again that it simply will not yield the results that parents or educators might hope for, which would be lower STI and lower unplanned pregnancy kinds of rates.
mm. I wonder how much of this is. I think the United States is this really interesting country, and talking to people from Europe, and even when I was in South America, I thought was very different. Because I think in the United States, there's this weird dynamic where our media makes us seem like we're very progressive in terms of sexuality, but then the dialogue we actually have at homes and schools are far more conservative in that way. Where like I think there are other countries where both the media and the inner monologues of people are both positive, sexually positive. And so I think that in the United States causes everyone to have this dynamic where they like feel shameful and there's like a part of them that feels shamed around it. But then the music, the movies, everything else is just very like sex in your face, marketing, everything. But and so it's I'm curious to see how these type of studies also turn out in countries where media is also conservative and the inner monologue is versus and then on the other extreme too where I'm like I think that's why people in this country have such a pull I feel like in some ways.
Yeah, so when I teach, actually, my students often tell me that they feel like there is a hypersexualization happening in the media, so to speak, and that they do receive the message, whether it's music videos, social media more broadly in terms of portrayals of sex or film or popular culture, that they're essentially being met with contradictory kinds of expectations, especially young women. And so young women are often portrayed as sexually active, for example, by the media. And there's also a tendency to sexually objectify women or to reduce them to objects in the media as well. So it's not always necessarily a healthy, positive representation of women's bodies and sex lives. But that contrasts with some of what we would call the sexual socialization or cultural messages around sex that they receive from parents, schools, and like the institution of religion, for example. And so what's actually happening, especially for young women, is they're faced with what's called a virgin whore dichotomy, where on one hand, they feel like if they're sexually active, they're going to be essentially called negative names, like a slut, for example, is very common. But if they refuse to partake in sexual practice, they feel like from their peers, especially, that they might be shamed for that. So I like to call it sort of a no-win situation, especially for young women domestically and in a lot of Western cultures, that there's really no winning, essentially. There's no way to sort of game the system that no matter what set of sexual choices that you make, women are going to be shamed, which really puts women in a double bind, as you can imagine.
Hmm. That I feel like a lot of this conversation is so pertinent because like I just had that experience in that moment where I just felt so much shame around like these experiences that I had felt was so intimate or beautiful. And I don't know, it just made me have to like sit back and reflect and be like, I think a lot of people inherit certain messaging, especially around sex, because to be honest, sex is a very critical piece of like what human structures are built around. I mean, it's a really vital piece of like everything, you know?
Absolutely.
So much of all of society runs around people's ability to engage in sex and all the kind of, yeah, I mean, it is so central. Would you say maybe, would you even go as far to say that everything revolves around it?
I would say everything is revolving around sex per se, but what I would say in terms of your comments is that yeah, sexuality is very vital. In fact, the World Health Organization includes sexual health as a core component of people's health and well-being, for example. And the World Health Organization goes as far to say that if you have an absence of pleasure, you may not be at your height of sexual health, for example. So even the World Health Organization is really acknowledging that pleasure is an important part of people's overall well-being. And
Hmm.
so I like to think of it as like, let's not just look at an absence of sexual pleasure and understand why that's happening, but actually, what really interests me in my research often are what are the kinds of catalysts or factors that lead to greater sexual pleasure in people's lives. So, not necessarily a question about the absence, but how can we create more pleasurable lives? How can individuals, both women, men, whether that's cisgender or transgender women and men, what are the processes that they can undergo or take that will lead to more satisfying and pleasurable kinds of sexual lives? And certainly in my research, I look at aging because I'm really interested how aging as a process can lead to greater sexual pleasure. And certainly I'm happy to elaborate on this. But I do find that aging is often a catalyst for women to experience more pleasurable sexual lives, often because aging prompts them to find their voice, for example, that people find greater sexual agency, the ability ability to make more sexual choices free of pressure and stigma and constraint. And so there are a lot of pieces, whether that's the accumulation of more sexual pleasure or becoming a more communicative person over time, that essentially do result in women experiencing greater pleasure. But I would ask more broadly, like, what are the factors that could lead to both heterosexual men and women experiencing greater sexual pleasure? And certainly we do know that sexual communication and ability to talk openly about sexual matters does matter for both men and women.
Hmm. But I'm so excited to get into aging. I have one last question on shame,
Sure.
which is, so I grew up in a really conservative community. It's like a subsect of a really tiny subset of being Indian. And one of the things that I always noticed is shame didn't only exist for sex. It existed for dancing. It existed for singing. It existed for pretty much anything that centered around pleasure. I mean, I still remember this really clear moment about a year ago. I had these two cousins who were about maybe 13 years old, and we were in the traditional family home. And pretty much I like had held on to their backs and we were like running around in these little circles. And I was feeling so much joy in that moment, and truly I really like valued that. But if give me 1 second, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
And it was just really fascinating because the second I did that, all these grandmas, they all looked at me and they said, "At your age, you can't be doing this anymore. You're having like you're not supposed to be doing this. Act age appropriate." And I was just having a good time. Like we were, I don't know. Like I always enjoy. Like I'd never experienced that before. I'd never felt policed on my ability to experience joy, and that was the first time I'd felt that. And I feel like oftentimes there's shame just on the feeling of pleasure itself, with and not even related to sexual pleasure, just pleasure. Why do you feel like? Where do you think those narratives maybe come from?
Be honest, I don't know. I always tell my students, I'm like, I won't ever BS you if I'm not sure about the socio-historical origins of a given phenomenon. And so I always think that humility is really, really important.
There.
But I will say that, like, and I can't speak, and I always try to be careful. I can't speak to cultures outside of the United States, especially. Did you grow up in India or did you grow up in the United States?
Mm-mm. But I grew up in the United States, but in a lot of ways I grew up culturally in India.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of the important retention of cultural ancestry and so forth. Um, Let me think on this one for a second. The way that I would frame it is maybe a little different than the way you asked it, truthfully. Particularly, I think we tend to view the world through like a deficit kind of perspective, where we tend to focus on the overly negative, unfortunately. We tend to especially do this when we think about marginalized groups in the United States, for example. We always assume that certain people are at a deficit, that they have a disadvantage. And that larger kind of cultural lens to think in a negative kind of sentiment, I think have led us not to introspectively ask enough questions about pleasure and joy. So, even for example, if you think about clinicians and like the diagnosis of mental health, for example, we talk about mental health from like a disorderly perspective. Accordingly, I think we don't have enough questions about like what facilitates positive well-being amongst different groups. And so I'd say really in some ways, like our fascination of thinking about the deficit, the disadvantage, the negative aspects of social life have left us in a place where we don't interrogate what brings joy, what brings pleasure to people. That's just me kind of pondering or sort of spitballing with you off the top of my head, so to speak. But I'm not a historian, so I can't necessarily trace some of the socio-historical kinds of origins of why we don't think about pleasure enough. I just think about it as a sociologist that so much of it is from a deficit lens in terms of our conversation, which greatly bothers me, suffice it to say. Like, actually, I think my next research project is probably going to focus on how LGBTQ people, particularly in the Southern United United States seek to cultivate joy and resiliency because I have grown tired of always talking about negative experiences that particularly marginalized communities face. And I'm interested in what kinds of assets that people with little power actually probably have in their own communities. What
Mm,
can people draw from, for example, in their own communities? And what are the processes that probably cultivate to greater joy and life satisfaction and positive well-being? And so, to be honest with you, Gotham, that's sort of where I'm headed with my research now. Is I've studied discrimination and I've studied negative experiences, even that women experience with their sexuality. And particularly with the LGBTQ community, I've spent a lot of time thinking about prejudice and discrimination and how it's linked with poor health outcomes and poor end of life care kinds of experiences. But I really think the time has come for both our culture and scholars at large to start asking questions about pleasure and what are the pathways toward pleasure and joy.
mm. I mean, that's really powerful. I'm curious for yourself as an individual, what do you feel like is the process to kind of move from a deficit oriented way of thinking about things to maybe what would you call the other side also?
I call it an asset or strengths approach, or a joy-centered approach. And so this especially interests me when we're having conversations about minoritized groups, because as a sociologist, for example, we tend to, in the field of sociology, we're interested in issues of inequality, for example. So that could look like a number of studies on the experiences of racially minoritized people in the United States. It could look at the kinds of discrimination that women, along with gender minorities such as such as transgender, non-binary people experience. It could look at the kinds of challenges that poor people experience domestically or globally, for example. Or in my case, I often look at LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer populations to try to understand how they experience social life. But our approach to this is because it is true, it is empirically true, for example, that these groups tend to have less power, right? They have fewer resources. They tend to occupy less governmental kinds of positions, for example. They tend to experience some disadvantages. But what that kind of discourse or narrative has done is it's perhaps unintentionally it's unintentionally resulted in us not asking if these kinds of communities also have assets or strengths that they can draw on from their own individual kinds of cultures. And so consequently, we're not asking questions about how facets of these communities or sects of these communities are able to derive pleasure and joy. I
Mm,
just think that we more broadly, and it's not just in the field of sociology, we more broadly work from a deficit kinds of lens when we talk about various subgroups
word.
domestically or globally. And that has gotten in the way. That deficit perspective has gotten in the way of us taking seriously conversations about joy and pleasure. It's a part of the story, but it's not the whole story. For example, LGBTQ people regularly find joy and pleasure in their lives. Our lives aren't solely characterized by prejudice and discrimination, although certainly part of our lives are. There's also been a movement more recently that you're probably familiar with of like Black joy, for example. And so even racially minoritized populations in the United States are centering conversations about how to cultivate joy in their lives and to have conversations about it. So we are living in a moment where I think that we are moving toward that. But we have to really supplement deficit kinds of approaches in our conversations.
Mm. I really like what you're saying. I think it has so many implications on education because I mean, I think about this all the time, even with disabilities. I mean, so many things where we often I've always been super fascinated by this, where when we think of somebody who might be blind or deaf, we think about them as like, ah, that's so unfortunate. They can't see. But my brain immediately sometimes goes to what is their world like? Like what strengths have they developed because of this particular framing of the world? I think people usually do, even with I'm an only child, and people's first response is, ah, like only child, like or something along the lines of only child syndrome. But I think as I've gotten older, I'm also realizing like even in the quote unquote things that people might perceive to be negative, there's always a different perspective that comes out of that. And if you're able to actually talk about those perspectives, you realize whatever situation it is that you were raised in, or in whatever way that someone else might pity you, there are a lot of beautiful things that come out of that as well sometimes. And being able to highlight that can, I think, be really powerful for also the individual speaking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that so much of what's happening there when we think about like even the experiences of disabled people, the default category, the normative category, the advantage category always gets treated as superior in some way, which can result, unfortunately, in people pitying people who don't belong to the default category, such as someone who's able-bodied, for example. And so much of disabled people's experiences are being compared to able-bodied people's experiences, but for example, we're not always thinking about resiliency. For example, resiliency can be like a really beautiful
Mm,
thing. And on one hand, like I sort of have a troubled relationship to the narrative and concept of resiliency because on one hand, part of why and how people have to become resilient is because they're really battling structural kinds of barriers, these social and legal kinds of barriers that make it difficult to be normatively successful, so to speak. But on the other hand, the ability to develop coping mechanisms can be really powerful, for example. And so when you're a minoritized person, whether that's being disabled, LGBTQ, a person of color, for example, you develop what I would say like a politics and pathway towards survivability. And in doing so, that set of coping mechanisms that you develop to make the world a bit more survivable can really be an asset in life, I would say. For example, I study LGBTQ people who are aging as well. And from a young age, LGBTQ people, for example, do experience a lot of barriers and they have to learn how to cope with a deeply homophobic or transphobic kind of environment. But what's interesting is that there's some research that shows that as LGBTQ people age, they find it easier to adapt to the aging process because they've already gathered some assets, such as like some strong kinds of coping skills and resiliency kinds of building skills that make later life kinds of barriers easier to overcome. And so that's all to suggest that there's something to be said about the assets that we gain through learning how to survive in a world that's not always kind to us.
mm. You feel like a lot of this has helped you navigate your life as well?
That's an interesting question. I So like I said, I have a complicated relationship to resiliency as a concept as a sociologist because I ask myself, like, why isn't the world already survivable for people? Why does life have to be that much harder, for example, for individuals who are minoritized in the US or across the globe? But I I do personally, like as a queer woman, I see my identity and experience as a queer woman as an asset. I see it as a strength, it has given me a particular way of looking at the world that allows me, for example, to defy convention. That is like it's giving me more autonomy and agency over my own decisions, for example. And maybe if I wasn't queer, I wouldn't embrace autonomy and independence and ability to kind of buck social traditions so much. And so in my own life, I'd say, yeah, it has given me autonomy. Uh, and in addition, just as a person who's aging, a lot of older adults would look at me and say, "You're still fairly young," but I'm nearing my 40th birthday, for example, and I've learned that I don't have to view the aging process with disgust or disdain, for example,
Mm,
but rather that I can see it as a sign of growth, as you described it, for example. Actually, I would say that as I near the age of 40, this is the happiest period of my life. My
aw.
life satisfaction has been the highest with each year of age. And that's actually tends to be pretty common, for example. There are other studies out there that show that aging can lead to a lot of growth and life satisfaction. So I've sort of tried to reject this view that even though aging is viewed as like a very negative process, I've tried to reject the view that I have to internalize that sentiment or that aging is something that I have to avoid. It's something that I'm finding is bringing me joy, although maybe I'll have a different view if I'm 60 or 65, if I'm experiencing a lot more heightened stigma and discrimination as an older person. But I've learned to embrace aging. I've learned to embrace belonging to a minoritized culture as a queer woman, for example.
Hmm. I mean, I feel like I'm excited to get into aging now because both what you brought up earlier with understanding how societies view sex and pleasure and aging are these like real subtle narratives that profoundly shape. I mean, aging is one of those things that I personally, in my experience of different cultures, think the United States handles terribly. I mean,
Yeah.
truly terribly. I mean,
Especially compared to non-Western
yeah,
societies.
the from I mean, I'm losing my hair. You know what? And that's fine. It's okay. If you're graying, it's okay. If you got wrinkles, it's okay. If it's the kind of over fixation on having looking at these things as if it's a problem. I was just at the Continental Breakfast downstairs, and constantly all they were throwing ads on were like wrinkle ads for if you have bags under your eyes, if you have this under your eyes, use this cream, use that cream. You got pimples, use it. There's kind of this medicate everything rather than like if you have bags under your eyes, maybe you're not sleeping well. Like maybe sleep. Try it, if you can, rather than just like, whatever. I mean, it feels like there's this deep I don't know where it comes from. I don't know historically when it started, where this kind of fear of dying, I think, is very normal. But the way you actually go about it, some people might actually pour more into their life, and other people might just try to make it seem like they're never going to die. You know, what I mean, there's so many ways to go about how you confront your fear of your mortality. But I do feel in some senses the the way we do it here sometimes is really sad. And so I'm curious for you, how did you first think to combine your work with sex and pleasure with aging?
Yeah, so I think it actually might be useful, Gotham, to take a step back to think about where ageism originated. Like, why is our culture so hostile? And then we can get into the aging and pleasure piece because it's going to naturally flow into why I started asking these kinds of questions. So, historically speaking, there are actually two major events that have led to such rampant ageism in Western societies in particular. One is that we saw during the 19th century, we saw huge improvements in medicine, hygiene, and nutrition, for example. So that prompted a major event which was longer life expectancy. And so, on one hand, that's great, right? People live much longer lives today than they did in the past. That's a huge win for public health, for example. But a natural outcome of that, for example, would have been that we would have started to physically recognize the signs of decline, chronic illness, and disease, which were all natural outcomes of living a longer life, for example. The other major event that coincided with longer life expectancy was really the institutionalization of retirement. And so once 65 became designated as a retirement age in the 19th century, we also saw these deeply hostile attitudes toward older adults began to develop. So we began to see that older adults were associated with decline, dependence on others. They were characterized as weak. They were characterized as fragile. They were characterized as sick. And if we're putting it more bluntly, unfortunately, older adults began being characterized as social and financial drains on the government, for example. And so those two events really in the 19th century mark a turning point for how we view aging and ageism more broadly. And so I always like to point that out that ageism and some of the hostile attitudes that result in prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes about older adults is actually a relatively new phenomenon, but it's linked to, again, an increase in life expectancy along with the institutionalization of retirement. However, I would say that the hostile attitudes that we have toward older people have actually only intensified. And so the relationship between medicine and aging is an interesting one because, on one hand, advents and advancements in medicine did lead to longer life expectancy. Like, we all want to live longer lives. That's awesome, right? However, the other piece of that is that medical technologies have allowed people to begin trying to think about how to resist the physiological effects of aging on the body. So you were just mentioning, Gotham, that you were in the lobby and you were noticing all these commercials for like skin treatments. These are all basically age-defying kinds of medical technologies that people are using. So you see an uptick in people using, particularly women using Botox, for example, or doing facelifts. We're living in a medical and cultural moment where people are really intensely internalizing this idea that they should avoid aging at all cost because we have such a deeply hostile view toward aging right now, which is really driving, the uptick in some of the cosmetic kinds of surgeries that are being used to avoid any signs, physically speaking, of aging. Now, this is all kind of the backdrop of how and why I began to ask some questions about the relationship between aging and pleasure, because part of that larger negative stereotype out there in terms of older people is that older people experience decline, that they decline rapidly with age. And that actually translates into our views of older adults as it pertains to sexuality. So, for example, it is not uncommon for people to assume that. Really colloquially speaking, that people's sex lives are ruined with age, essentially. Of course, we have this narrative about men, for example, that they'll experience erectile dysfunction disorder, which will make it difficult, if not impossible, unless they obtain Viagra, to continue to have penetrative sex. So we assume that even men without medical technologies are going to, or medical kinds of treatments, are going to be in a position where they can no longer have active sex lives. But I would argue that related to that, because of this assumption of sexual decline and dysfunction with age, we often assume that older adults are asexual. And this is particularly the case for women, where we just assume that older women, for example, don't want to have sex. And part of it's linked to ageism because so many young people, for example, are unfortunately experience a sentiment of disgust when we talk about older adult sexuality, and that idea can be internalized. There's some evidence even that older women do internalize the notion that they should not be sexual, for example. But
Oh,
I know it's a really sad reality because I would argue that all people are entitled to a sexual voice. All people are entitled to sexual
yeah.
agency, but older women, in particular, have been erased from conversations about sexuality by virtue of us assuming that they're asexual. And so, this is what really opened up this research for me. Is I saw this relative absence, culturally speaking, and in the scholarly literature, of conversations about older adult sexuality, but especially older adult and aging women still being sexually active. And so that got me thinking, well, why don't we just ask older women? Why don't we just ask aging women about their experiences with intimate life? And that really propelled an entire research agenda for me, which has been a beautiful experience for me in terms of interrogating aging and sexuality, and deeply rewarding professionally as well. So that was a really long
Mm.
answer to your question, but I wanted to give you kind of some backdrop of how and why I arrived here as a sociologist of sexuality.
That was fire. No, that was fire. No, I mean, also you're so art like I feel like I don't know how you got through that whole thing with I was like, you have to say at some point. And you didn't. I was like, there's no I wish I could speak that long and not say I mean, I would I'm working on it. I'm practicing, but that is super cool. Did you ever like actively practice that?
No, I didn't practice it. I jotted on some bullet points yesterday as I was preparing, but this is a spiel I've given over and over again because I've spoken at academic conferences all across the country about aging and sexuality, and why it's time. It's well over time that we start thinking seriously about sexuality as people age. Because I
Yeah.
mean, large swaths of the population are aging, right? We're all aging every single day. That's a biological reality. So most of us are going to hope as we age that we get to have our own voice about our intimate lives, that we get to make our own
Mm,
choices. And in this current moment, we're really robbing older people of a voice to get to have a say about sex, especially when people respond
mm,
from the lens of disgust, for example, which is extremely common. And so I believe you
mm,
sort of alluded to, you had asked me earlier or previously about how attitudes towards sexuality have changed more broadly. Well, those attitudes have changed about young people in large regards, but we still heavily stigmatize sexuality
Mm,
among older adults, which I think is very troublesome because, like I said, shouldn't everybody have the freedom and choice to have a say about how their intimate lives unfold? Shouldn't everybody have autonomy over that?
mm. You know, it's interesting because I feel like these conversations also extend to just like thinking about your parents having sex. And I think that's like something where I'm like, that's so fascinating how many people I know share the sentiment of like, that's gross. I don't even want to think about that. But that in itself is a really fascinating, like, kind of construct. You know, like, why is it so bad to be like, I hope my parents are having sex? Like, you know, like, I genuinely hope, like, there's nothing gross about it. There's nothing wrong about it. I hope they genuinely get to spend that intimate time with each other and get to connect in that way. Like, what is so gross about that? I don't understand that. And I guess here's another question for you because I think one of the most complex thing about this is I think it's really hard to imagine it being another way when you can internalize so much shame and then everyone around you doesn't talk about it, so you don't even get to really understand what are people's sex lives like, you know. And I think that part is super fascinating where it's like everyone has this like sexual being in their mind where the only people who get to see that side of you are the people you share that intimacy with. Everybody else has no idea that that world of yours exists, which is just so fascinating to me where it's like you don't ever get to meet anyone's freak, but everyone just walks around with it just like in their mind. And then if you share that moment with them, a whole new version maybe comes out. And then you go back to just like functioning. But to imagine a world where it doesn't have to be this kind of like even how private it is, for example. I mean, even your body. I mean, the fact that we don't get to see each other naked to me is kind of mind blowing. I mean, I've never seen my parents naked. My parents have only saw me naked till I was 8. They don't see me like that in itself is so mind boggling to me sometimes. I'm like, what would be so bad if we just saw each other naked sometimes and like didn't have to make this a whole thing? But then to imagine what that would look like is really difficult. I mean, I've always thought about that. Like, if I ever have children, do I want a household where we're allowed to all just hang out naked if you want to? Like, what would that look like? What would that be? Are you allowed to talk openly about sex? And so a lot of this, I think, is also hearing stories of other people who think about it far differently than you so that your brain can even like imagine. There's this podcaster I really like. His name is Aubrey Marcus, and he talks a lot about his open relationship. But that was the first time I'd heard someone even talk about what a polygamous relationship looks like. What are the challenges? How do you handle jealousy in such an open way? It wasn't so all of a sudden now I kind of opened the door a little bit into understanding this new way of framing sexuality and love and all these things. But it would be cool to like have a book where you get to hear all these stories of different families and different people and how they navigate it, just so you can even kind of figure out what is possible.
Yeah, one thing I might respond to that you said there is can you even imagine a world where we talked about sex openly, or for example, we didn't shame the body so much, for example, and that I always tell my students like the status quo isn't an inevitability. Bear with me; it's getting later in the week. So the way that the world is structured in terms of sexuality is not an inevitability. For example, we could do things differently. We could choose to socialize our children differently. For example, the U.S., for example, could be more like European nations where we don't have abstinence only education. There are a different set of cultural choices that we could decide to make in the United States surrounding sexuality. And so when I talk to my students about this, because I teach human sexuality classes every spring, I teach a class called Sex and Society, and it's a widely popular class at my institution, for example. And in those conversations, we often will think together, we will imagine a different world in terms of sexuality. And for example, if you're socializing your children, like, do you have to shame sex, for example, during child rearing kinds of practices? Could you have scientifically responsible kinds of conversations with with your teenagers, for example, about sexuality. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should encourage your teenagers to secure a high number of sexual partners, because of course we know scientifically that the more risky kinds of behaviors that you embark on, the more likely you are going to contract something like an STI, for example. But we could have what I think of as like fairly sane, healthy, scientifically grounded conversations where, for example, your teenagers have access to condoms. That might seem crazy to some people, but it's actually scientifically backed. Like, it's completely data driven to say that people need to have access to measures that allow them to have safe sex and avoid STIs, for example, during adolescence and during the college aged years, for example. We could envision a world where we weren't just solely funding abstinence only education in the school system, which historically has always been the case, and it persists. We continue to fund abstinence only education domestically. That's where we put our dollars when we invest in sex education in the United States. But that's not an inevitable kind of outcome. We could financially invest in comprehensive sex, for example. So even if we just change the relationship between families and school to matters of sexuality, we could actually fundamentally transform society and have healthier sexuality, for example. We could be having conversations about sexual consent at really, really young ages in age appropriate ways, for example, such as kids should have the right to say, for example, just something very basic, like, should children have the right to deny that a family member can give them a hug? Something very, very basic in terms of bodily autonomy. If we changed our relationship to how we think about the
Mm,
body, for example, and people's bodily rights, that could be huge for politics of sexual consent more broadly, for example. So we can re-socialize. We can rethink the way that we're socializing children at young ages, which would lead to what I like to say is would lead to a process of deconstructing normative sexuality in the current moment. If something can be
mm,
constructed, humanly created and driven, it can also be deconstructed and recreated. But we just have to re-engineer how we talk about and think about matters of sexuality in given key institutions, such as like the school or the family, for example. And so, like I said, like, the status quo is not inevitable. The ways in which we think about sex and sexuality in our culture, there can be a world where we're more open, and in fact, there are societies, particularly in European societies, where people are far more open with sexuality than especially white religious Americans often are, in particular.
yeah, I really like what you said that it doesn't have to be an inevitability where you can always, these things can and have changed and will continue to change.
They've changed
And
drastically, even right here in
yeah,
this already.
yeah. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think I also coming from a very conservative culture and learning kind of this spiritual, the kind of like, I don't know, the other world of sex, I think has also been really beautiful, because I think that's also something that is not spoken about too much here, where I think sex is often just talked about as like a means of pleasure or as a means of like reproduction, but it's not really talked about as a means of connection. Like, but truly, like, because I think the world of connection through sex is a whole universe on its own that like is very separate from just like pleasure. I think even when people talk about the Kama Sutra, they focus so much on like the pleasure aspects of the book, where I think there are entire philosophies that focus on the like how deeply two consciousnesses can connect through the practice of sex. And I think bringing light to that conversation also, I think, changes people's relationship with how they think about sex. Where it's not just like, oh, it's like fun, it's like enjoyable, which is also very true, but it is also a way for you to, I don't know, I think about that sometimes where I'm like, it's one of the few acts in the world where you can like leave your own kind of sense of self in the highest form and actually like merge consciousnesses with another person and feel it's like co-creating at like the highest level. And I think like that to me, the more I learn about sex through those lenses, I also find the kind of maybe the reasons why people try to like protect like the or maybe the original reasons why people even hypothesize maybe you should share this really intense connection with a few people and not like thousands. And but then I feel like what I've noticed in a lot of conservative traditions is that if I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, then the only way I can convince you to do it is either through fear or shame. Because I don't even know why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it because someone told me, and then I never really actually questioned it. And so I feel like a lot of times when people make it seem like conservative beliefs are just like built on randomness, I think, or just like it's just an arbitrary decision. I think there is a lot of value in them, but at some point somebody really understood why they felt that way, and then eventually those reasons were completely lost, and then all that's remaining with us is the fear and shame behind it. And so I just think that's why there's also maybe possibly some valid reasoning behind abstinence as well, but it just now all that exists is like, oh, but if you're not abstinent, you're shameful, you're fear, or like you're not pure. But these are all just like kind of empty concepts, not real reasons why it's beneficial for you possibly to also be so. I don't know,
Yeah, I think part of the answer is that people should have bodily autonomy. I don't think that we don't think that we have to completely like flip the script necessarily and say that like really active sex lives are far superior to abstinence or anything like that. For example, like I don't necessarily
Yeah.
think that that has to be like the yardstick through which we measure things, but if people have bodily autonomy, like that's a beautiful thing. The ability to make their own choices free of social constraints. Because, for example, there are even some people who are aging that might report pressures, especially like aging men would likely report pressures to remain sexually active because that's how they hold on to manhood, for example. To not be sexually active, for example, would imply that aging men are somehow fragile, not capable of conquest, or it's really, how do I put this? I've gotten off track a little bit. It's so
It's
bear
okay.
with
There's
me.
no track. It's a conversation. There's no track.
um, some men, what I was trying to say is that some men just they experience intense pressure, I think, as they age to
Mm,
remain sexually active for fear that they will no longer be viewed as masculine, for example, but rather they would be viewed as frail or as in decline in some way. And so that's not necessarily a great narrative either, for example, when people are still facing intense kinds of social pressures. But I would say that both aging men and women should have more autonomy and say over their sexualities, for example. A place that's not great to be in is when older adult women, for example, are they're socially in a position where it can be really difficult to find a partner, for example, or they may feel deep shame about continuing to remain sexually active, for example, and that's a place where bodily autonomy is lost, for example, and so that's not to suggest that it's solely a doom and gloom kind of story. As older adult women age, for example, they tend to experience gains in intimate lives as well. They, as I've noted in my research before, they tend to experience more sexual pleasure. They tend to become more open to matters of sex as they age and so forth. But this is all to say that with the right amount of circumstances, and in this case, aging opens up a process of bodily autonomy. But bodily autonomy is possible for people. But I don't know necessarily that the answer is just abstinence or just a lot of sex per se. But the answer for me is that everyone should have bodily autonomy, get to have a sexual voice, and get to have some kind of semblance of sexual agency to make their own decisions free of constraint. And so I always think we have to be careful in these conversations not to center one or the other, because there are some aging women who actually do want to abstain from sex. And they report actually that menopause in particular opens up a space for them particularly if they experience biologically, less estrogen in the body, they may be in a position where they don't want to have as much sex, for example. And so hormonal changes can drive that. And so even some elements of the aging process allow people to say, actually, I want to abstain from sex. I no longer socially feel this pressure at all. But the answer is really bodily autonomy. The answer is that everybody gets to have a say about their own sexual lives. And so that was a bit of a ramble in comparison to your original question, but hopefully taps into
yeah.
what you were saying there.
No, for sure. I mean, I think the answer to so many of these things are opening up dialogue to remove the shame around it and purely just talk about it without having to feel one way or another and to without shame. Um, yeah, 100%. And, I mean, in general, I mean, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I mean, I feel like this was a great conversation. And I think it was the first that we've had about sexuality, I believe, on the show so far. And so to be able to bring it into this pleasure conversation, and it is something even in having this conversation, I realized how hard some of the topics were for me too. Just to say these words out loud, I mean, to say orgasm gap, to say sexuality, to say these things out loud and to address it rather than feels kind of shy about it or I mean to face it. I feel like there's a lot of growth for me to also have eventually when we do a season on sexuality. But I want to say thank you for kind of setting the foundation for that and being with us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it. Thank you for having me. Sometimes I actually forget, Gotham, that um, the world is so different than the one I inhabit. For example, because I teach, I write about sexuality. It's at the center of my research agenda, and so it's just like it's become human and second nature for me. But I think we can all think of a world that's re-engineered where we can have much more open kinds of conversations free of shame, and that everybody, regardless of gender, race, age, nationality, gets to have greater sexual voice and say and autonomy about the intimate aspects of their lives. And so I'm going to dream of that world, and I hope your viewers will too. So thank you so much for
No.
having me.
Yeah, I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We are almost wrapping up season 10, but thank you for staying along with the journey. I hope you enjoyed, and as per usual, stay re educated.